Ocala's information station, 1370 WOCA.
Ocala.
Diamonds in the sunset, now your time has come.
All right, 24 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. Robin, you and I were born in the 50s.
Yep.
I remember in the 60s when I was, starting to become more aware of what was going on in the world. I went to a store. I was a department store up in New York, and I was with a friend, and he was buying a gift for his father. And the lady, and of course, keep in mind, we're just kids, maybe 10, 11 years old. And the lady says to him, well, is your father liberal or conservative? Uh-huh. And he said, well, he dresses conservative, but he's a liberal. And so he got a tie.
Okay.
and I said to Bobby, his name is Bobby, I said, Bobby, what the heck did that mean? And then he went on to explain it to me, and it was over my head. So at 10 or 11 years old, Bobby knew, I had no clue.
There you go.
Right? So now as we approach 60 years old, I still wonder if I know what I mean, I know some of the basic things, but sometimes I consider myself a conservative in some subjects. You know, if we're talking about libraries, I'm very liberal with libraries. I don't want to see them go away.
No.
But I'm very conservative with certain ideas, I guess you might say. And so let's find out about America specifically. And the book that is going to help us with this is written by Jennifer A. Delton. She's on the phone. She's a professor of history at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York. She is a regular contributor to Salmagundi magazine, is that right? Her book is called Rethinking the 1950s, How Anti-Communism and the Cold War Made America Liberal. Let's find out about that from Jennifer. Good morning, Jennifer.
Hi.
Where are you?
I'm in Saratoga Springs, New York.
You're still there? All right, well, good. Thank you for being on the air with us. Is it cold up there?
It is. It is. But not as cold as it is in Minnesota. So.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Everything's relative, right? Well, thank you for being on the air with us. Yeah, we have evolved in the time that I've been alive. Anyway, it's easy to see. What I sense is different, though, unless I just wasn't aware of it, is that sometimes, especially since I do a radio show, sometimes the two words liberal and conservative are almost like bad words, like almost calling somebody a name depending on which side you're on. You know, if you are a liberal, that's a good word. If you're not, it's a bad word, right?
Exactly. And, you know, one of the things I try to do as a historian is to try to define these terms and what they meant at certain specific historical moments. But it's hard to do because I love the story you just told, because there are so many ways in which you can be conservative and so many ways in which you can be liberal. So it's very difficult to try to sort through that. And as you say, then they become loaded terms as well, if you're on one side of the political spectrum or the other. One of the things that I loved, like about the 1950s, is that the world of the 1950s is not as politically polarized as the world today. And it's one of the reasons I was interested in going back and trying to understand what liberal and conservative meant in the 1950s.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm glad you said that because you are more of an expert at this, but that's what it seems like to me, kind of, rough sketching it in my own mind, is that we weren't as polarized, is that the right word?
Yeah.
As we are now, and I hope we go back to being less polarized. I don't know. It's like we're divided lately. And here's the other thing. Everybody seems to think conservative also means Republican, and liberal means Democrat, and that's not always true.
Yes, yeah. And if I can just talk to that point, that's one of the interesting things about going back to the 1950s, is that the Republican Party wasn't wholly conservative, nor was the Democratic Party wholly liberal. Because, for instance, in the Democratic Party, you have the New Deal liberals, and those are liberals who see that the federal government is something that can be used for a force of good in society. So you have those New Deal liberals in the Democratic Party, but you also have those Southern conservatives, those states' rights Dixiecrats, are also in the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party itself is divided. And if you look at the Republican Party, you have those business, Midwestern, Main Street business owner conservatives, But you also have this northeastern, very liberal, cosmopolitan banker type Republican who are much more liberal. And so when you look at the politics, you'd have liberal Republicans cooperating with liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans cooperating with conservative Democrats. And there was a lot more room for the deal making and the horse trading that used to be part of politics that we can't seem to do it these days.
And that might explain why there's always this deadlock in Congress.
Exactly, because the ideological positions match the party lines, and that's just a recipe for deadlock.
All right, now, so let me just connect the word communism to this, or anti-communism to this, because again, this is coming from many callers during the many shows that Robert and I have done. It's almost as if there's a thinking by some, and I would say the some I'm referring to typically would consider themselves conservative, and they will say liberal is the stepping stone to socialism, which is the stepping stone to communism.
Yeah. And that, there were conservatives in the 1950s that believed that very thing that you just said. But what's interesting, and I think we sometimes forget when we use the word communist today, is there actually used to be real communists. Communists who were part of the Communist Party USA, which was a party that was an international party and controlled by Moscow. And so in the 1950s, anti-communism was very specifically against those communists in the Communist Party. And so for that reason, there were liberals who were anti-communist. And that's the other thing my book does is, remind people that most of the anti-communism that we associate with Joseph McCarthy came from liberal people like Harry Truman. And Harry Truman was the president who instituted the Loyalty Security Act, which banned communists from being in U.S. government positions. Walter Reuther, who was a very liberal labor leader who banned communists from his unions. Mm-hmm. And Eric Johnston, who was the head of the Hollywood Motion Picture Association, was a very liberal man, but he banned communists from the movie industry. So these were all liberal people, and by liberal I mean those people who embraced the view that the federal government had a role to play in the economy and in creating a social welfare state. But they understood that communists, real communists, not people we think are communists, but people who were actually part of the Communist Party, had to be eliminated from American life. So there's a real difference there.
And were those people spied upon by the U.S. government, say like the people in the entertainment industry? Were their houses bugged and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that happened, but what we have to remember is that the communists themselves, some of them, not all of them, but some of them were, in fact, spies for the Soviet Union. So there was all kinds of spying going on. But yes, you point to a very important thing. That's one of the things we remember from the 1950s is that the FBI was interested in people who were accused of being communists. But and that happened. So yes, that happened.
And we actually spoke to somebody, a well-known man, who had a story to tell us about that. Carl Reiner, the actor, writer.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. He released a book last year, I guess it was. Uh-huh. So we had him on to talk about his book, and one of the chapters in the book, which he talked about to us, was about that portion of his life where the FBI or somebody came into his house and literally he was scared.
Yeah.
He was scared because they were basically grouping him with the communists.
Right, absolutely.
So they got it wrong, obviously. I mean, while he had very strong feelings about liberal things and conservative things, and some of the effects that the thinking had on the entertainment industry, particularly what Ronald Reagan, the deregulation of TV, I guess, that Ronald Reagan signed.
Were all the elected officials during the 1950s, everybody in Congress, were they all males, or were there some females elected during that time of the period?
There were females, not a lot. There was Margaret Chase Smith, who was a senator, moderate Republican senator from Maine. Minnesota had Koya Knutson, and there were women scattered about, but it was not common.
And did they have like different rules because they were female?
No, I think at that time, I mean, not that by roles, no, they represented their constituencies just as males represented their constituencies.
Oh, so they were accepted then within the political arena.
Yes, well, there are certain stories that one can tell, but they were. I would say they were.
Oh, okay.
All right, let me just reintroduce our guest, and I have, I guess, a specific question about the book. Jennifer A. Delton is our guest. She's a professor of history at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York, which is where she is right now. The book is called Rethinking the 1950s, How Anti-Communism in the Cold War Made America Liberal. Now, just using that title as a basis for my question, what I said earlier about the fear or the accusation that liberal thinking leads to socialism thinking leads to communist thinking, but you're saying the exact opposite happened, right? By anti-communism, we became more liberal.
Yes, and that's kind of the punchline of my book. And the way that happened is that when liberals opposed communists, which they did because they wanted to get communists out of their organizations, because the communists of the Communist Party were in liberal organizations like civil rights organizations, the unions in the movie industry, and and unions in general. And what they argued at large was, look, if we are going to defeat communism, we have to make sure that capitalism as a system actually works, that democracy and capitalism will provide a better life for more Americans, for all Americans, than a communist system could. So there's a way in which the anti-communism becomes a way in which we can show that democracy and capitalism is better than the communist government. And that means that we're going to have to that the federal government is going to have to play a more active role in maintaining economic security, for instance, or providing civil rights for all Americans regardless of their color. Because the communists are going around the world saying that the United States is a racist country and that the people of the world who are decolonizing, who are breaking free from the European empires, they've got a choice. They can either go with the communists or they can go with the Americans. And so in that atmosphere, the American government had to show, look, we provide equal opportunity regardless of race. And so the federal government has to really crack down and try to solve the race problem in the United States, which means getting rid of Jim Crow in the South. And it's these years that the federal government does that. So my argument is basically that because the United States had to show that democracy and capitalism would provide equal opportunity and justice, in a way that the communists couldn't. It was a way that we had to compete against the communists to show that we were a better system.
And isn't it interesting, the word capitalism, truly, if you think about what capitalism is and what it's supposed to mean, and I've had authors who argued with me that capitalism was bad, but it almost seems like both liberal and conservative understand that to be able to buy something low and then sell it for a profit is not such a bad way of living.
Capitalism has produced enormous wealth and wonders, and it's the creative, dynamic force in society. It's created progress. There's no question about that. It also, has a lot of unsavory side effects. And what the liberal aspect was look, we can make capitalism work. We accept the basic premise of a free market economy, but what we want to do is use the government to regulate and to make sure that economic prosperity occurs so that we can avoid these economic depressions. And if that means having an income tax that's a progressive income tax, we will do that. If that means priming the pump with Keynesian liberal economics, we'll do that. So they weren't afraid to use the federal government to make capitalism more efficient. That is the liberal argument. And so liberals said, it's not true that we are communists or socialists. We want to make capitalism work for everyone.
Right, and I understand that. And taking the workers' rights and the workers' needs to heart, and developing unions and making sure that the average worker was getting a fair wage was key to that.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering if absolutely, corruption can corrupt, or whatever the saying is. If the corrupt people who were involved in the unions may have caused that whole setup that was looking pretty good for a while to backfire, I don't know. I mean, corruption is a bad thing.
Well, yeah, and there's too much. I mean, the thing about the unions of the 1950s, and you look back, is how strong they were. And I think that's because labor unions were able to get rid of the communists. Now, there is the element of the gangster and the mafia elements in the unions, and that was also dealt with in the 1950s. There were the Kavaver Estes hearings in the 1950s, and to try to deal with that problem. And, yes, there was problems with unions being corrupt, but nonetheless, that the 1950s remains an era of high union participation by the American workforce. Unions were strong then.
So how is America going to get back on its feet? Because Larry had a story this morning that China owns a certain percentage of America because America's so in debt to China because they're holding our notes.
Exactly. As a historian, we don't deal with how can we get back. We just tell you where we once were.
Where we once were, and it's important to know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important to know and to know how we got where we were. But I have no solution to what to do about that problem.
Well, this is a wonderful opportunity to speak to Jennifer. She obviously knows her stuff. It makes sense. She's a professor of history. Now I understand why you referenced Minnesota. I didn't realize. I'm looking at it now. Your BA is in American Studies from the University of Minnesota, PhD in history from Princeton. Your other books are Making Minnesota Liberal, Civil Rights and the Transformation of the Democratic Party, Racial Integration in Corporate America, and the new one, Rethinking the 1950s, How Anti-Communism and the Cold War Made America Liberal. We do take phone calls during the course of these interviews, but I won't do it if you don't want to. Do you want to take calls?
Yeah, whatever you want to do.
Or whatever, okay. All right, there you go. Good morning. Thank you for being patient with us. You're on the air with Jennifer Delton.
Yeah, good afternoon. Well, it's not afternoon yet, but anyway, good morning. One of the things that keeps coming up from that time period is everybody brings up Joe McCarthy. And Joe McCarthy did the things that Joe McCarthy did, but they try to level everything on Joe McCarthy, and Joe McCarthy was in the Senate, and there were things that the House Un-American Activities did that were not at all related to Joe McCarthy. I don't stand as an apologist for Joe McCarthy, but I don't like to see him see things hung on him that were done by the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
That's a great question. I always have to explain to my students that the House Un-American Activities Committee had nothing to do with Joseph McCarthy, other than that they were all swept up in the anti-communism of the era. And I would argue what's interesting is McCarthy does. It's funny that you don't want to hang the crimes of HUAC on McCarthy, but the Congressional Committee, they worked much more closely, so that would be HUAC, with the labor unions. And one of the points I make in my book is that labor unions who wanted to get rid of their communists would say to the House Un-American Activities Committee, come on in and clean up this labor union. And that kind of cooperation didn't happen. McCarthy was kind of like a lone wolf, crying communist. But so I would agree with you. It's important to keep these different actors in anti-communism separate, just for accuracy's sake. So it's a very good point.
If we lifted labels and just had conversations about the different issues, which is very hard to do, actually, if you know somebody is normally associated with the label. But I've often thought, this is what I think, that there are some very, very intelligent people who you would consider liberal. And there are some very, very intelligent people who you would consider conservative. And if the two sides would say, let's listen to that guy, that lady, because she's very smart. Maybe there's something I'm not seeing. That might be the way to kind of come up with some kind of a compromise, which for some reason has become a dirty word itself. I don't even understand that. But I mean, as a nation, you don't, like somebody ultra conservative wouldn't even want to spend tax money on a sidewalk.
Yeah.
Or a library, and things that I think, okay, you don't want to get rid of libraries and sidewalks,
Yeah.
So
yeah, and
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
What's so interesting about, again, the 1950s is that there were people who were generally seen as conservative who were willing to compromise. And I'm thinking here of Robert Taft, who was the senator from Ohio, who, he was called Mr. Republican, and he was reliably conservative. He really was not happy with the New Deal. He wanted to limit the federal government in all kinds of ways. But then he'd come out and say, it might be a good idea for the federal government to give funding for public housing. And you'd think, and he'd say, because this is what we need to do as a society. So even someone very conservative like Robert Taft, had views that and supported policies that were not conservative. So my point is that that's the kind of where even though people thought he was conservative, he was not so bound to his ideas that he couldn't compromise or see the wisdom of a certain kind of policy that might not be considered compromise. And in fact, he and Eisenhower, they were political rivals in the Republican Party, but by the end of their careers, they had really grown to respect each other because, as you say, they were both intelligent men who cared about the country.
Would the future have been different if Eisenhower wouldn't have been president and there would have been somebody else in that position?
Oh my gosh! Yeah, the counterfactual. Yes, obviously it would have been different, but who knows in what ways?
Yeah, right. A lot of people point to JFK and FDR as two of the great presidents, both being Democrat. Also, you'll have a lot of conservatives who say, well, they don't really pick on JFK too much, but they'll pick on FDR a lot. So, obviously, they both contributed to this country greatly. And it'd be hard-pressed to say that either one of them was not conservative, at least in some ways, right?
Oh, Roosevelt and Kennedy?
Yeah.
A lot of historians say that they are, in fact, conservative in that they didn't go far enough. So one interpretation of Roosevelt is that he's actually saved capitalism. That by instituting the New Deal, he averted real socialist change that could have happened in America because there were, after all, socialists and communists in America. And what Roosevelt does is end up saving capitalists for the capitalist class. Same with Kennedy. That he could have gone further in many of his reforms, but he didn't. And in fact, Kennedy, and I'm sure you've heard this, a lot of people are very critical of him because he wholeheartedly fought the Cold War and increased American activity in Latin America and most noticeably in Vietnam.
One of the interesting comments about Chris Christie lately is that he's a pseudo, is that the right word? A pseudo-conservative, that he's not, So those who don't want him to be running for the presidency are saying, hey, be aware, he's not really a conservative. But isn't that what we're talking about? As somebody who maybe has a bulk of their beliefs in one camp, but is smart enough to know, hey, some of these other ideas are pretty good.
In a democracy, you have to talk to each other and negotiate deals. And we call this compromise, which is a bad word now, because conservatives are demanding that conservatives stand by their principles, and liberals are demanding that liberals stand by their principles. And it didn't used to be that way. People used to understand that in a democracy, the whole point, the way that Madison and Hamilton conceived this, is that people have competing interests, and it's in the government, in the in Congress, that those differences get hashed out and resolved, and deals are made so that we can all live together.
I'm sorry, Jennifer, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I have a thought about how your book might actually affect people in my position, people who do radio shows. I think a lot of times, whether they are high profile like the Rush Limbaughs or low profile like me and Robin, that we may not be as educated as we want people to believe we are. By being able to read the conclusions of somebody who's actually done research on this, like yourself, maybe if we're absolutely going to be opposed to what you are saying, if we digest it and understand what you're trying to say, maybe you'll make it through to some of us thick-headed knuckleheads in this business. And I mean that with all sincerity. I really truly think we need to be looking at this through somebody with a more intelligent approach to it. Because bottom line is, you studied it. You know what we studied? We studied how to push buttons and turn on microphones.
Yeah.
You know, so I think you're going to make a great contribution, I think, through the book.
Oh, thank you.
Through the readership, but also through those who read the book and pretend they didn't.
Yeah. Well, my feeling about, obviously I'm a historian and would love more people to know history. And when you study history, you find that nothing is as cut and dry as people think it is. Like conservative, as you say, you've got conservatives on one side, liberals on the other, thinking this is true, and you go back in history, and none of those lines hold. Everyone's wish-washing across those lines, and it's just very hard to get a stable definition or a stable principle. And once you realize that, I think you can let go of some of that.
Jennifer, it's been great to talk to you. It's an honor, and you're educating all of us. I guess that's what a professor does, is educate people. And the professor on Gilligan's Island just died. Did you see that?
Yeah, that was sad.
Thank you so much.
Jennifer A. Delton, the book is called Rethinking the 1950s, How Anti-Communism and the Cold War Made America Liberal. Jennifer, how do we get the book?
You can find it on Amazon.com.
On Amazon and probably everywhere else. And do you have
any bookstore?
And do you have a website?
Amazon.
And do you have a website, Jennifer?
Not really. I've got a little thing at skidmore.edu, which you could take a look at. The listeners can.
Okay, Skidmore. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Great interview. Thank you.
Yeah, great interview.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. We'll take a break and we'll be right back.
You're listening to WOCA News Talk 1370, Ocala's source for what's happening in today's hottest, up-to-date news and topics.
How good does it get?
Golf has long been considered to be sport's most prestigious game, and WOCA has your connection to everything in the golf world. Every first and third Thursday at 10 a.m., tune in for Let's Talk Golf with your host, PGA professional and teacher to the stars, Jim Beckett, and operations manager for the links of Spruce Creek South, Darren Irwin, right here on the